at the mosque, which we did, and we walk in, and one of the first men that I met there was a guy. If I had to select a classic looking Muslim man, this would have been the man. He had a white tunic on, a beard, he had a hat, and one of the brothers. He comes up, and Sadiq introduces me to him, and the first thing he says, "I just listened to your sermon." I thought that was so awesome.
Well,
So the point you made is true. We're all one.
God is one, my father used to say.
Yes. David, do these lights work?
Yes, push the button on the top. Sorry.
Oh,
They said the
If
cool
you push it
lights.
twice, they go brighter.
I didn't
Wow.
do it last week.
It's 2 levels.
This
so
is
if you want-
really good.
you want
No,
one more.
This is really good. I can see fine.
All right.
Okay.
I wish they had that when I was learning how to read on the candlelight.
Yeah. No, this is-
That's why I destroyed my eyes. At that time, probably the technology was not ready.
So do you ever wonder about the real significance of coincidences? We have coincidences in our life all the time, things that happen that are unexpected, and I wonder about that a lot. Why things happen to me? Why do I meet certain people? Why do I fall into certain circumstances? And particularly when these coincidences produce some great benefit. And you look back in the rear view mirror and you say, I never saw this coming. It seemed like a coincidence and it produced a great benefit. So are they really coincidences? And that's what I want to talk about.
Not really. I think that God wanted us to come here.
Yes, that's what I've come to as well. So a coincidence is a remarkable concurrence of events or circumstances without apparent causal connection. So it's a remarkable concurrence of events or circumstances without apparent causal connection. So they're just random things that happen. We can't see the connection, but they're kind of remarkable, and sometimes they produce a remarkable result. So I ask, are they coincidences or are they what I call sacred intersections?
Sacred. Wow.
intersections.
Sacred.
Sacred intersections are ordained by God, and they're ordained to intentionally carry out His desires. And He knows all of this, but we don't. We're the chessmen on the chessboard being moved around, encountering these coincidences, but He knows different. He knows that they're not coincidences. After all, God is omnipotent, which means that He has the power to do anything. And He's also omniscient, which means that He knows the past, the present, and the future. So why couldn't He orchestrate our coincidences? I think Psalm 139:16 puts this in a context that really shouts out that there are no coincidences. And this is what Psalm 139:16 says. Your eyes saw my body being yet unformed, and in your book they were written, all the days fashioned for me before there was yet one of them. So your eyes, speaking of God, saw my body being yet unformed. And in your book they were written, all the days fashioned for me before there were yet one of them. So when you look at it from that perspective, from God's perspective, there are no coincidences. This was all preordained in advance. So today we're going to look at one sacred intersection in the lives of Jesus and a leper. Jesus and a leper. This is of course, a healing was produced by this coincidence. And it's the first recorded healing of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. And for me, it speaks loudly that we must always be ready for God's intercession in our lives, because we may not know it's about to happen, but He does. So, in a sense, just at the perfect time, God's timetable and our faith will intersect and we'll receive a blessing in our lives. So God's timetable, which we may not know about, but we have faith, and we're on the lookout for these things, those two things will intersect and we'll receive a blessing. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So our passage is in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 8, just 4 verses, verses 1 through 4. And I'll read them, and then we'll go through it in a little more detail. Starting in verse 1 of chapter 8. When Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him, and a leper came to him and bowed down before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, "I am willing, be cleansed." And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, "See that you tell no one, but go show yourself to the priest and present the offering that Moses commanded as a testimony to them." 4 short verses. Read this a bunch of times, haven't given it much thought. Interesting, but when I dig into it, of course, I find that it's really a jewel box of meaning. And so we'll go through it in a little more detail, and I'll try to show you what I see in it anyway. So verse 1, when Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. So this story immediately follows the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus has just given the greatest sermon that was ever given, and he's coming down the hill. Now the Sermon on the Mount was a sermon where God gave to the world the true meaning of the law, the true meaning of the Old Testament. And it's an exciting sermon when you dig into it as well. So he had just achieved this glorious peak of telling the world the true meaning of the law, and he comes down the hill. And as verse 1 tells us, when Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. After this spectacular sermon, he had a bunch of people following him. He was a celebrity. He was on his way, in fact, to becoming Time Magazine, the Jerusalem Times Man of the Year. And there were thousands of people following him down the hill, and he had just given this magnificent sermon. So now we go to verse 2 with that backdrop. And a leper came to him and bowed down before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, make me clean." Now verse 2, the first phrase of verse 2, and a leper came to him and bowed down before him, is really astounding in itself when you consider that culture. In that culture, lepers were considered unclean physically and spiritually. And in fact, it was believed that God had afflicted the curse of leprosy as a punishment to a person for the sins that they had committed. So a leper was not only viewed as an extremely sick person, but they were viewed as someone who God had cursed because of their sins.
In some culture, being sick is in Eastern Europe, right? You might know. It is the sign that something is wrong with your genes, and being sick, for example, epilepsy, your career is pretty much over in any field.
So it's very much the same thing, and I am aware of that in the culture my family came from.
So
Health
you can't.
is viewed as a blessing from God,
Sure.
and sickness is viewed
If you
as
are
a
sick,
curse.
you are not supposed to tell to anybody, not even your best friend. Forget about your best friend. You have to keep the secret until you die. That's how it is.
Well, and we're going to talk about that. It's how it is here too. So leprosy is really an ugly disease. We know it as Hansen's disease. And Webster's actually defines it, describes it. It's a chronic infectious disease affecting the skin and peripheral nervous system, characterized by the formation of nodules on the skin that enlarge and spread, accompanied by loss of sensation with eventual paralysis, wasting of muscle, and production of deformities. It's a slow, painful death.
Wow.
Almost everyone in that time that had leprosy died. And the very few people that survived carried with them hideous, painful scars for the rest of their lives. So in addition to the physical manifestations of leprosy, In that culture, lepers were also stigmatized by society, and that was because their affliction was viewed as a curse from God as a result of their own sins. And that's described very well in 2 verses in the book of Leviticus, which I will quickly read. This is what Leviticus 13, verses 45 and 46 have to say about lepers. As for the leper who has the infection, his clothes shall be torn, and the hair of his head shall be uncovered, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean all the days during which he has the infection. He is unclean, he shall live alone, his dwelling shall be outside the camp. So leprosy in that culture was second only to death in terms of seriousness from the standpoint of ceremonial defilement. So the only thing worse than touching a leper would have been to touch a dead body in that culture. And the rabbis who interpreted the Old Testament, they had their own spin on it. Their interpretation of the law of Moses went like this. They got much more specific. If you're a leper, you cannot come closer than 6 feet to another person.
Wow.
Even if that other person is a family member, 6 feet. You can't come any closer. And if the wind is blowing, you can only come within 150 feet of that person. So
Makes sense.
if you're upwind and the wind's blowing, it's 150 feet. Leave it to the rabbis to create impossible rules. And as I said, lepers had to live outside the camp, which meant they were ostracized and had to live out of the city, usually in a colony with other lepers. And that pattern has really been repeated through the centuries. You know, as recently as 100 plus years ago, there was a Hawaiian island that was the repository for lepers from all over that region. And
Manalua or something
it's,
with the M.
it'll come to me in just a minute. Which I,
Molokai. And nobody was allowed to go there unless
One
special-
Catholic priest, Father Damien, went ministered to the lepers
Wow.
for decades and ultimately contracted the disease and
Wow.
died. But so that wasn't that long ago, and yet those lepers were also ostracized from society.
In Second War, they used to kill every lepers in my country. Everybody.
Yeah.
Just
Undoubtedly,
executed.
it goes back to this idea that they're cursed. They're not just ill; they're cursed. Said he.
But I can see the logic behind that. I mean, I think the real reason behind it is the fact that they're so infectious,
Yeah.
and that if anybody comes in contact with them, even like the priest that try to take care of them,
Right.
there's certain kinds of leprosy that are not contagious,
And then certain times.
but then
they're
there's certain
very-
times it is,
very-
and they didn't know that back then. So I think most of the laws that they created back then in Leviticus were based on survival.
Yeah.
You don't eat certain things like pork because if you don't cook it right, you wind up with, worms and stuff like that. So
Correct.
I don't think it was like they were ostracized in them because they had to make it seem that way to keep people away from them.
They were burned. Their body was burned. No.
Well, it was definitely a big problem. It was definitely a big problem. So, in this, Doug,
Yeah, the pork back then was not able to be preserved. It would be bad. You can't preserve it with salt. If you today, pork has to be preserved with gunpowder. Like for instance, if you eat bacon, it has a gunpowder taste to it. If you take the gunpowder taste out of the bacon, bacon has no flavor. It doesn't taste good. They back in the Western days, they used gunpowder. They would shake it on the, on their food. But cowboys would stick a fuse in the gunpowder in the shaker and just light it and let it explode and stuff. They were real bad. So people there was gunpowder control basically after that basically.
I think until the
I'm
night.
never going to eat gunpowder again.
I think until
Bacon again.
Let them finish.
even the
Alex,
United States
Alex.
banned everybody
Alex.
who was not sick who was sick to enter United States.
Alex, you gotta stop talking on everyone, okay?
Okay.
So we can keep going.
Okay.
So in verse 2, the leper
Sorry.
came to him and bowed down before him. This was a radical act on behalf of the leper, on the part of the leper, because he was breaking the law. Remember, the rabbi said you cannot come closer than 6 feet to anyone, and this leper came to Jesus and bowed down before him. So he was within the zone that he wasn't supposed to be in. And it's even more radical when you realize, or when you recall, that in verse 1 that Jesus was in the midst of an enormous crowd. So not only did the leper approach Jesus, this leper walked right into this crowd. So he was violating the law left and right. He was putting himself at great, great legal risk. So this leap of faith really showed the lengths that this leper was willing to go to have contact with Jesus. The great lengths, the risk that he was willing to take when this opportunity presented itself.
Can I say something else?
No, no.
Ask you.
Okay, and this leper took this step, this leap of faith, without any real evidence that he would be healed. So when I stop and think about that, that's really remarkable. How many leaps of faith do we really take? You know, we make educated guesses, and we may take risk that's calculated, and we're admired for that. He's a risk taker, but he takes calculated risks. But this leper, this was an uncalculated risk. He risked his life, literally, by breaking the law in order to have contact with Jesus. Lord, are you willing? If you are willing, you can make me clean. This is what he said. Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. I look at that and I say, what humility, what surrender. He was sticking his neck out a mile, putting his fate completely in the hands of Jesus with no evidence, hard evidence, that anything was going to come of it. The man had tremendous faith. Now, to me it's interesting in verse 2 where he says, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. He specifically asked for what he needed. He specifically asked to be made clean. He didn't say, oh Lord, I just want to be in your will. Whatever your will be done. He had a need and he specifically asked for what he needed. You know, we're told in the book of Hebrews in chapter 4 that we should come boldly to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. I think sometimes we feel like we can't approach God boldly with our requests and that we have to kind of beat around the bush or pray in his will and hope that he knows what we really want. But we're told in many places in the Bible, including this passage, that God is interested in what we need. So this man told him what he needed. He told him what he needed. Verse 3, after he said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately the leprosy was cleansed. So just like the leper taking the risk of approaching Jesus in a crowd, of breaking the law in order to have contact with Jesus, Jesus took a risk too. He took the risk of touching the leper. So, verse 3 tells us, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. Touched him. Now, Jesus was God, and I don't think he had any concern about being infected, but remember I said that leprosy was considered to be a curse, and touching a leper would make you ceremonially unclean. Jesus had a lot of conflict with the religious elite in Israel at the time, and by touching this leper, he was opening himself up for a severe reprimand from the leadership in the church. So he took risk. He took risk as well. He took the risk of drawing the ire of the church leadership. He also took the risk of freaking out his own disciples, because these disciples were raised as Jews, and they were well aware of the 613 rabbinic laws. And so when Jesus reached out and touched this leper, it probably freaked them out too. So he definitely took risk. There was a movie made, one of the many movies that have been made about the life of Jesus, and I don't even remember the name of it, but it was showing at the Mary Pickford a couple years ago, and I went to see it. And there was a scene in that movie where Jesus came into contact with a leper, and this guy looked awful. They had made him up to be a powerful negative figure as a leper. I mean, literally his skin was falling off. And Jesus went to him, put his arms around him, drew him close to him, hugged him, and as he was hugging him, the leprosy just subsided. It just went away. It was an awesome sight. And that's a little bit of what was going on here. Lord, if you're willing, make me clean. Jesus said, I am willing. As he reached out and touched him, boom, he's clean.
Excuse me, was that the last temptation of Jesus Christ with Mel Gibson?
No, this was an unknown group of actors. Yeah, but it was an awesome movie, and that one scene, that's the one scene I remember. That was such a powerful scene, such a powerful scene. So the leper trusted Jesus enough, he had enough faith to take the leap of faith, and Jesus was willing. He was willing. And I think this is one of those sacred intersections that I'm talking about. That day when the leper was on the road, he probably had no idea what he was going to encounter, that Jesus was going to be walking down the mountain from giving the Sermon on the Mount. But he saw the opportunity. He saw Jesus come into his sight. He saw the crowds. He saw his own need. And he humbled himself enough to make that leap of faith. So, on the other hand, Jesus responded to this by demonstrating that he's a merciful God. Merciful God. You know, after his mountaintop experience, remember, Times Man of the Year, he didn't blow this guy off. He's coming down with the crowds. The crowds are probably praising him, loving him. He didn't blow this guy off, even though he was among the lowliest of the low in that culture. He didn't say, wait till I'm done with my preaching. Or maybe you'll come to my next healing service. Didn't say that either. He didn't say, oh, I'll pray for you, like we so often do when someone comes to us with a need. Jesus didn't do that. In fact, Jesus touched him. He dropped everything he was doing and touched him and immediately healed him. He met the need without hesitation. And I think we should all remember that the next time someone comes to us with a need. You know, we're all guilty of this. I'm certainly guilty of, this, I'll pray for you, I'll keep you in my prayers. We all say this. But I think the next time someone comes to us with a need, we should really reflect on whether we can meet that need then and there on the spot, because we could be engaging in one of those sacred intersections. This could be a sacred intersection that will produce a great blessing, and by saying the normal cliches that we say, we may be missing out on the blessing. So we go to verse 4. After this spectacular healing, Jesus says something strange to him. He says, "See that you tell no one, but go show yourself to the priest and present the offering that Moses commanded as a testimony to them." Now that's an odd statement in my mind, because here they are in the midst of this great crowd. The leper walks right in the middle of the crowd. I mean, he couldn't cover up what he was. He was a leper, and everybody knew it. The crowd probably was recoiling. So however many people were there, hundreds of people in the vicinity, they all had to know that this leper was approaching Jesus and that Jesus healed him. So this is an odd statement, and it whet my curiosity to try to figure out what this is all about. What was Jesus really getting at here? So if we go back to our old friend Leviticus, in chapter 13, we see that there's an elaborate process of cleansing that went on when a person had leprosy. It involved ceremonial cleansing, it involved physical cleansing, it involved making offerings to God to deal with the curse element of it. And Leviticus 13:13 makes it very clear that only the priest could declare someone clean from leprosy. So at the end of this process, only the priest could say, "You're clean." And only when the priest said that could you re-enter society without the stigma of being a former leper. So, even though the leper may have had the appearance of being cleansed by Jesus, Jesus touches him, whatever he had clears up instantly, definitely has the appearance of being cleansed. In that culture and in the law, there was a process that he had to go through, a process that had to be completed before he could be declared clean. So what I believe that Jesus was really saying here was, don't tell anyone about this miracle until you have the proof. Go to the priest, go through the process, make the offerings, let the priest declare you to be cured, to be healed, and then tell the world. Then tell the world. So I believe that's what Jesus meant when he made that odd statement. So this is a curious story, and it's very interesting to me when you look at all the components that go into making the story, all these bizarre actions. You know, a leper walking into a crowd of people, bowing down before Jesus, Jesus reaching out and touching him and instantaneously cleansing him. It's a very odd story, but there are some points that I think are very, very relevant to us. One is, notice that the leper didn't have a name. And that's because we're all the leper. We're all the leper. And this story is really about each one of us. It's about each one of us. This story is a real-life allegory regarding our sinfulness, our repentance, and God's great mercy. That's what this story is about. Focusing away from the physical deformities of the leper, focusing in on the spiritual deformities that we all have. So, in the Bible, leprosy is really a symbol. We call it a biblical type. It's a symbol of our own sinfulness. And sin, like leprosy, is a chronic infectious disease. Now, a chronic disease is one that persists for a long time or constantly occurs. So it's an ongoing thing. That's a great example or definition of sin in our lives. It persists for a long time and it's constantly occurring. No matter how hard we try, we will fall into sin, just like the leper falls into leprosy. Sin is infectious like leprosy. We continually reinfect ourselves. Think about it. You know, we have our sins of choice, and if you think about it, you'll say we do constantly reinfect ourselves. We may say, you know, oh, Jesus, strengthen me so that I can resist X, whatever X is. And we'll go along for a while and we'll be strong, and then boom, we fall back into it. So it's recurring, just like leprosy. Like leprosy, sin is also accompanied by the loss of sensation. It's a gradual loss of sensation. But as we practice sin more and more, we really become numb to it. I remember in my past life doing awful things that I felt no remorse for. In fact, it was so remarkable, even to me in that condition, that I would remark to myself, it is so odd that I just hurt this person and I feel no remorse about it. Oh, like leprosy, I had lost my sense of sensation. We become hardened as we practice sin. Like leprosy, sin is a slow and painful killer. Depending on what your sin of choice is, it can kill you. Like leprosy. And finally, like a leper, or like leprosy, we can't cure ourselves. We have no ability, like the lepers, to kill or to cure ourselves while it kills us. We need a priest to cure us, just like in the Old Testament cases of leprosy. Fortunately, as Hebrews chapter 4 tells us, that Jesus is our great high priest. But unlike the high priests of the Old Testament, who would put you through a process, cleanse you physically, administer your offerings. Jesus bore our sin. He became sin for us so that we could become the righteousness of God in Him. He paid the price that we couldn't pay for our leprosy. So to secure, like the leper in this story, to secure the cure for our sinfulness, we have to humble ourselves before Jesus. We have to bow down before Him and say, if you are willing, make me clean. Now we may believe that we're so sinful that Jesus would never be willing to cure us. That's easy to believe, depending on where you're at in your progression. You may believe, I'd go to church, I'd give my life to Jesus, but I don't think He would ever be willing to cure me. Just like the leper said to Him, if you are willing. He raised the possibility that Jesus might not be willing. But like the leper, when we ask Jesus, are you willing to make me clean? He will always say, I am willing. He will always say, I am willing. It's as simple as this. Paul tells us in Romans 10:9, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised Him from the dead, you will be saved. Simple, straightforward. Are you willing to make me clean? Jesus is willing. So, is it a coincidence that just when we reach that point in our lives where we're ready to ask for salvation, is it a coincidence that Jesus is always there to deliver it? It's no coincidence at all. Because in the book they were written, all the days fashioned for me before there were yet one of them. It's a sacred intersection. It's not a coincidence. It's ordained by God from before you were born, because God is all-knowing and all-powerful. He knows the past, the present, and the future. So if that's the case, why doesn't God just serve up a sacred intersection for all of us? Just save all of us. Wow. Why just serve it up? Here it is. You're saved. And that's because He gives us free will. He doesn't want robots who follow Him because they have no choice. He wants people to choose Him. So He gives us free will. And just like the leper, God wants us to bow down before Him and ask Him, Lord, are you willing to make me clean? So the great barrier between us and God does not lie with God. It lies with us. Because God's always willing to heal us. He's always willing to save us. But we're the ones that are stubborn. One of my favorite questions is, if God seems distant, who moved? It's always us that moved, never God. So I think if we remember nothing from the study tonight, we should remember that if we're willing to humble ourselves, Jesus will always say, 100 times out of 100, I am willing, be cleansed. And I'm just very thankful for that. We can say that at any point in our lives. We can say it as children, as middle-aged people, as old people, and He is always willing. We can say it on the last day of our existence on earth, and He's always willing. It's an awesome thought.
I was so sinful. We had a cholera in the city, and my mother, who was very racist, very discriminatory, a doctor, told me not even to come close, not even there, like isolated, forgotten people. And I had a friend who was a nurse, who was caring for them. I don't want even I didn't want to shake hands with my friend who was a nurse. Now I feel so, when you were telling me, I wanted to cry how I was unmerciful to those poor people who didn't, that was not their fault.
Right. He was so merciful.
But I didn't know for better.
Yeah.
I just didn't know.
I remember once a guy that I worked with got yellow jaundice, and he shows up to work one day and he was yellow. And everyone was going, whoa. No one wanted to get near him. I remember his doctor called me and asked me if I would spread the word, you know, Jeff's got yellow jaundice, it's not contagious. You shouldn't shun him. You should embrace him. But that's a normal reaction as a human being. We see somebody's different, somebody that looks ill, and oh my God, I might get sick. Just like the poor lepers. Jacob.
Well, it's like in the 80s when AIDS first came out. And sorry my voice, but it's like in the 80s and people were afraid and people said that was passing punishment and all of that type of thing. It was like type of scenario.
Exactly the
Afraid
same
of the
thing.
unknown, right?
Exactly the same thing. And you know, when Joseph Sharp tells me the story about how he was a chaplain in the Parkview Hospital in Dallas, which was full of people who were dying of AIDS, and he was ministering to the AIDS patients, even though he had AIDS himself. That was a very courageous act. That's antithetical to our human nature. So, it's awesome. You know, yes, Chris.
Oh, I was just going to add that, you know, I mentioned a couple weeks ago that I decided to, turn my life over to God and do His will in church like a month ago. And, you know, within hours later, I was being just repeatedly, the intersections you mentioned. I mean, people coming to me and approaching me with offers to help. Things like that. You mentioned need. Yeah, I think of a need in just 24 hours, the solution.
Yeah.
So, and I've always thought, reviewing my entire life, atheist and all that, what you said about free will, I've always been a big believer in that. But now that I look back, it seems like everything I've ever done, going to law school, all my jobs, people I've met, relationships, my alcoholism, recovery, living in the homeless shelter, every single thing I believe God put on my path to get me to what I need to do today.
Exactly.
That's how I feel about it.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in that. I think we have a series of sacred intersections in our lives, and we frequently don't understand them when we encounter them. But then later, when we look back, it all becomes so clear what they were all about. Mark, have you had a sacred intersection?
Continuous.
I would say so.
Sometimes I get in a few accidents too at that intersection. My sacred intersection happened many times. Well, when I was 17, I became acutely aware of the mess I was in. My own mess. I mean, I was a pile of mess. And I cried out to God. I was at home. I cried out to God. I said, God, if you'll heal me of my mess, I'll follow you the rest of my life. One of those kind of prayers. And 2 weeks later, a woman walked into where I was working. I worked in a library. I was a wallflower as a high school student. I couldn't put two words together without stumbling over my feet. And she just looked at me, and she looked into my soul, and she just said, do you want to go to church? And it wasn't that she invited me to church, it was that the presence of what was going on at that moment. And it's so, I was in church the next Sunday because I couldn't sleep until I got there. And what I realized is that, this story reminds me of how God has healed my leprosy, and about how sometimes we are sacred intersections for lepers and people in this world, and how God uses us to be a sacred intersection.
Absolutely.
The two women, I'm sorry, I don't mean to go on. Can I
No, go on and on.
30 more minutes? 30 more seconds. I was working for these two women in Desert Hot Springs, and they're just, these wonderful Jewish women from New York, and they were just strong personalities. And I was working for them for about 2 or 3 days, and I thought, oh God. But the Holy Spirit spoke to me and said, you know what, on the last day you're going to pray with them in their office. And I thought, all right. So I get ready to finish up, and we're sitting in the office, and I said, can we pray together? We're Jewish women from New York. She says, yes. What does that mean? So we stood in a circle in their office and we prayed, and I thought, I don't know what I'm going to pray. Come, Holy Spirit, that's all I knew how to pray. And we began to experience the presence of the Lord in that little circle. And these women were just wagging their tails. It's like, what is happening? I talked to one last week. This is a few years ago, but I talked to one last week. They're in Brazil, traveling through Brazil right now. And she says, I can't wait till we get back and have another prayer meeting. and I realized what's going to happen. I'm going to invite them to come to dinner on Wednesday night. So you guys, if they come, you get to meet them.
Yeah, it's really deeply touching when you have one of those experiences. It makes you feel like nothing can ever make you feel. It's really awesome. Dwayne.
My sacred intersection happened on 9/11. I've been in the military for 21 years, special operations. I become numb to the world, so I became a leper. I didn't feel pain on anything I did. But working in Pentagon that day, a plane struck the building. I went in on search and rescue, and I carried out a Navy ensign, Melissa Rose Barnes. And she looked up before she died and says, why did God let this happen? I go, God did not let this happen. Men let this happen. And I cried. For the first time in the 20 years I served, I cried and I felt emotion again. That was God touching me.
What an intimate moment.
And gave her the comfort she needed as she has.
You know, and we've seen some of this, I think, on the news coverage of the floods. We've seen people helping people, reaching out and meeting their needs. I think there have been a zillion sacred intersections through that great tragedy. And there will be good that will come from it. Just,
Don't ignore the signposts ahead.
yeah.
You walk right through that intersection in this lane.
Yeah. So we have to wonder how many of those sacred intersections have we walked right by and never gotten the blessing. It makes you want to really beware, be on guard, be watching, be watchful for the opportunities. So from one leper to another. David?
I was just going to say, you know.
Not that you're a leper.
Yeah, I'm definitely a leper. It's kind of easy for me to anticipate those sacred intersections when I sort of get a little clue before, you know, like if somebody's going to come and meet you and you're anticipating them coming, or some gift is being sent to you or something, you kind of get a little hint of it, so you anticipate it. But it's a lot harder for me to keep thinking, well, God wants to do it every day, but I'm not really anticipating it. I don't know. It's strange to me that I get complacent without noticing that He's really doing it in every moment.
Right.
Not just, it's like the sacred intersections that I notice seem to be the big ones, and then I want Him to do other big ones all the time instead of, it's the little ones too, you know. And I think I'm so amazingly selfish that all I want is the ones that I really notice and really stand out, instead of being satisfied with the little ones that come and believing that they're really sacred as well. And so to me, I just share that as an internal struggle.
I think it's very true. I mean, you know, how many times have we had an encounter with someone, just a brief encounter, but there's an intimacy about it that changes you and changes them. That's a little thing, but it's huge. That's huge. Well, awesome. Ray.
For me, until I started having a relationship with God, I just believed everything was coincident. And once I started having a relationship with God, then I no longer looked at anything as a coincidence. There was always a reason for this happening. You know, it wasn't like, wow, I'm lucky to run past you. Now it's more so like, I ran past you for a reason, you know. And sometimes I search for it. Sometimes it go right past me, though. You know, depending on, I guess, my relationship with God at that time, the state of mind I'm in at that time. Because sometimes I'll recognize it later on, you know. And like Pastor David and I, we was in the office a few weeks ago, and things was just happening right before our eyes. Where, you know, I may mention that somebody asked about me or said something about me, and bam, as soon as I said it, the text came on my phone. I asked about Daniel over here, and as soon as we came out, this all together. As soon as we walk out the office, Daniel stood right there. It was like everything was just happening back to back, and Pastor Dave kept saying every time, you know, it's not a coincidence. This is not a coincidence, you know. So I believe that the more that I stay engaged with God, you know, that I would accept that these are not coincidences that's happening. This is a purpose, you know. But the trick of it is distinguishing if this is a lesson to be taught by me coming in contact with an individual, because sometimes these are lessons for us as well, you know. So sometimes I have to take heed that this is a lesson. This right here is something that I need to work on right here, and don't look at it as a curse.
Okay.
It helps when we don't look at it as a curse and we
Back
try
here,
to
Mark.
find the blessing. Sally, and then we'll wrap it up with Alex.
I wanted to say that it's kind of bringing up like a vision of Pharaoh's, you know, when he didn't, his heart was hardening, and it just kept getting worse. He lost his child, he became numb, and he still went after God's people, you know. Going through all this, you know, his how do you say it? You can say that it feels like at the end, because at the end, God has given everyone a second chance, and through that second chance is where God eventually, due to His perfect plan, Egypt, they're going to become His people, just like the children of Israel is going to become. It's always been God's inheritance, and then everybody in between is still the light workers. What brings us together
Right.
in unity, the three.
Exactly. Alex, last word.
Yeah, so in my culture, the gypsies are considered a lower class citizen. This is what it is. And my mother was very racist. But one day, something happened, miracle. There came the old gypsy lady, and she normally doesn't open the door. But she opened the door, and she told her there is something, and she was pregnant with my sister, and she lost 3 or 4 pregnancy. She could not have another child. And she told her that she gave her the food and this. I want to cry. And she told her there is a snake over there, but there is a little bird who is knocking that snake, killing that snake. So my mother understood that this is a biblical cord embodied around the neck of my sister, and if it was a regular, it would be death of the child. But she insisted to have a cesarean. They told her, no, you don't need cesarean, you don't need the cesarean. The X-ray could not see anything. But she insisted. And when they did that, wow, how come we could not see it? Sometimes when you open the heart, when you understand that people are different, miracle could happen.
Yeah, of course.
That's right.
He gives us great wisdom and discernment.
You know, Mark, it was interesting because I had thought last week I was going to say, well, everybody can share how they got here. You know, to me, those are all
Yeah.
exact topics.
I was
It matches
cracking up
the
when you said that.
right, that's going on.
I thought we rehearsed
It's
it.
the little things, right?
Yeah.
You know, it really is.
And they have profound
Families have a
Praise
lot
the
of
Lord.
fun.
Yeah.
Praise the Lord.
I love you guys.